Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for being here. So first we're going to start with Alejandro Ciordia. His presentation is titled Collective Action Fields and Interorganizational Networks, Insights from Charitable Food Provision in Greater Manchester and Environmental Activism in the Basque Country. Alejandro is a postdoctoral researcher in political sociology at Autonomous University of Barcelona. Political sociologists focus on social movements and collective action. His doctoral research examined the recent evolution of interorganizational networks within the Basque environmental field before and after the end of violent conflict. His main research interests are civil society organizations, social capital, interorganizational networks, environmentalism, nationalist movements, repertories of contention, and political violence. So, Alejandro.
Full screen. Why is not going? Okay. Oh. Okay. Okay. Well, so thank you all very much for coming. All of you here, all the people online as well. And thanks, Carla and José Luis, especially for inviting me today to present here. It is great, the first times are always nice, right? So it's my first time presenting here. It's not, it hasn't been very long since I joined the department shortly before Christmas. And to work with Miranda in a project where we study polarization in interpersonal networks, but this is not what I'm going to talk about today, because today I thought it would be a good opportunity to kind of talk a bit about my previous research, or, well, an actually ongoing research that I do besides this project that relates more to social movement studies, activism, political participation, focused on at the organizational level. And also, I thought it could be a good opportunity to do a kind of an unusual presentation. Unusual in the sense that this is not the typical paper-based presentation that I go with introduction, hypothesis, data, and so on. But it's more just I want to present a core argument that has analytical perspective that has guided a lot of my research, and just illustrated with a couple of very different empirical settings in which I have applied this perspective. So, okay, this is how I have structured the presentation. So I will go first with the starting points and the main argument that I want to develop and its theoretical foundations. Then afterwards, I will illustrate it empirically with these two very different cases, and then recapitulate at the end and make some further reflections that I hope can lead us to a good discussion afterwards, and to go in depth in some aspects of the presentation that probably I won't have time to dig in to it while I present, but maybe we can pick up afterwards. So, okay, so here, this slide, basically, if you are in a rush and have to go, you can leave after this slide, because this is the core of it. And I know this is probably not a very good marketing strategy, but it's the truth. So this is the basic point, that collective actions and social network analysis, collective action fields and social network analysis can go together. Collective action fields, and here is a nice definition provided by Mario Diani and Anne Nish, is my core substantive empirical interest. The analytical vantage point that I think I find more interesting when looking at social movements and collective action, not looking at, let's say, if we want to study environmental climate change collective action. I wouldn't like to, I think it's better to focus on the collective action field that encompasses not only organizations particularly focused only on climate change activism, but also maybe trade unions, maybe feminist organizations that are also involved in climate change, maybe academic researchers, everybody that has a stake on the issue and that interacts and are aware of one another. And then social network analysis is my theoretical and methodological interest that I favor also as a researcher. And I think it's a good way the both are very complementary, and this symbiosis is very fruitful. And even though for me it's obvious, or it's an assumption, for many people it is not, and that's why I want to make the argument. And well, when you combine both of them, you get this kind of output, an interorganizational network, in which, in this case, the nodes are organizations, civic organizations of any kind. Depends on your theoretical interest and the inclusion criteria. It can be more or less formal, grassroots organizations, and the ties would represent also relationships of interest that can be collaboration, shared members, shared discourses, etc. And of course, I am by no means the first one that has applied this perspective, but still, I side with this kind of approach. Okay, having said that, let's take a step back. Because I have started already talking about collective action fields, but what is a field in the first place? So field theory can be generally represented or conceptualized as an approach in the social sciences whose essence is in the explanation of regularities and changes, I would add, in individual action by recourse to position vis-a-vis others. So in this sense, it's a meso-level theoretical approach, in the sense that it focuses on what goes on between the micro and the macro. And it's a relational theoretical approach that regards relations between actors as the key analytical dimension of social phenomena, the constituent element of social structure that social researchers should focus on. So within field theory, field would refer to the analytical construct that conceptualizes this local meso-level social order in which collective action takes place. And this social order provides opportunities and constraints to a delimited set of social actors that are the field members that take one another into account because they are oriented towards a common practice, issue, or goal. And a common doesn't mean that it's consensual, it doesn't have to be consensual, or that this common goal around which the field is structured is not disputed. But there is a generalized sense of a common purpose or issue at hand. And then I have talked about field theory to simplify things, but actually it's a kind of big box that encompasses different approaches that have that emphasize some aspects on more than others. But as many researchers have pointed out, they have these common elements that I have outlined before, and we can distinguish three different varieties of field theories. First, the Bourdieusian field theory formulated by Pierre Bourdieu, who himself didn't specifically formulated a field theory in this sense, but the field was along with habitus and capital, one of the three core concepts of his theorization, right? So then we have new institutionalism from economists and organizational theorists that focused on organizational fields, particularly talking, and they inductively derive their theories from economic organizations, industries, and so on. And then we have strategic action field theory, which is a more recent attempt of integration of the former two, with also some additional elements, especially, I would say, while Bourdieu and new institutionalist theories were more focused and did a very good job in explaining the reproduction of a certain field and the dynamics within a certain field. 𝐵𝐫𝐶 and 𝐵𝐴𝐴 also tried to expand and to explain the emergence of the field and the change and the transformations of the field over time. So that's why I find this more strategic action field theory more interesting, more appealing, and I want to focus that on that. But first, I wanted to say that it's not the only field theory in place at all. And actually, I remember this was one of the first books that my thesis advisor supervisor advised me to read when I started. And of course, it was kind of influential, even though now I was reviewing my dissertation, and I think I referenced it only once. Like it goes very tangential in my dissertation. But it was really influential, as I will explain later. And these are, in my view, the basic tenets. First, strategic action fields are fundamental units of collective action with flexible boundaries. This will be important later, within which there is a certain degree of agreement about what is at the stake, who has power and why, and what are the legitimate ways of conducting of conduct and interaction. Then this field is internally presents power asymmetries internally. Because actors are unequally positioned, and they specifically theorize and define a bit three likely positions: incumbents, those that benefit from the status quo of the field; challengers, that challenge the status quo; and governance units in some fields that kind of mediate disputes in the field. Then the thing that the third point, that actors vie for advantage, and that there is a mix in every field of competition and cooperation. And this competition and cooperation actors can advance their position through the exercise of power, using the diverse capital that they have at their disposal, but also through social skill. And this would be defined as the differential capacity of actors to induce cooperation in their favor, not to force through power, but to induce it. Then they have two very particularly interesting observations on the Russian doble structure, and the idea is that within every field contains a multiplicity of internal fields within it, or potentially contains multiple fields within. And also that every field is influenced by its broader environment. It's embedded within a complex web of other fields of varying size and proximity, and that so it's not an isolated social space. And then the final point is that I advanced it a bit before, that fields can be stable and where the rules are very clear, very established, a lot of reproduction is going on, but they can also be in an emergence state, new fields coming up, or in a crisis state, where transformation is going on, an episode of contention is going on, and these changes may come through endogenous power competition, internal forces within the field, but also from exogenous shocks, large-scale events. We can think, for example, about COVID crisis, how has influenced a wide variety of fields, or from some external field influencing and contaminating another one, right? So having laid these foundations, there is a long-standing methodological controversy in how to study fields, and in particular, if social network approaches are a good way to study and to operationalize fields. And there are some who say, like, no way, absolutely not. And some prominent theorists, like Bourdieu himself and 𝐵𝐫𝐶 and 𝐵𝐴𝐴, who in their own formulations of their work, they explicitly say like, no, an analyst should not use social network analysis because it's kind of superficial representation that doesn't tell us anything about the real dynamics that structure the field. But then there are many others who say like, yes, they are compatible, and there are many commonalities because at the end of the day, social network analysis is a relational methodology. So why shouldn't go with a relational theorization? And of course, I cite here, I reference a few authors, and I side with this second group. And yeah, my objective, as I said before, is to argue in favor of the compatibility of the two, even desirability, I would say, because I think that the benefits go in both directions. So in one way, interorganizational networks. So social network analysis is a suitable way to personalize strategic action field concepts and hypotheses, and I will illustrate that with the research on food charities in Greater Manchester. And then on the other way around, strategic collective action fields provide a theoretical guiding lenses for the design of social network analysis research and the interpretation of the results. And that's what I will try to illustrate with my second example. So I'm going to be a bit quicker in the second part. So first, this is the first illustration about food charity in Manchester. First of all, disclaimer, I have to say this is pure. This is not my own research. This is the research project of my good friend and brilliant colleague, Filippo Oncini, who did his PhD at the University of Trento, like myself, but then he moved to the University of Manchester as a Marie Curie Fellow and to study charitable food provision in the UK, which is a rising phenomena, because unfortunately there is all over Western Europe, but particularly in the UK, according to some data, rising levels of food poverty and food insecurity. And as a result of this need, there are also many more charities that try to cover that problem. In reviewing research about it, that there are more and more research about this topic, he found that there was a gap at the meso level. So there was a lot of research on the structural causes of the need for food support. There was a lot of micro-level ethnographic research, but the meso level was missing. So that's the reason that motivated him to try to study the charitable food provision in one specific urban area, Greater Manchester, through the lenses of a strategic action field theory. And first, Filippo is a mixed methods analyst like myself, but his project was initially mainly qualitative, and he conducted extensive field work in Manchester, including 42 semi-structured interviews, analysis of organizational documents, and participant observations in meetings of umbrella groups. And he kind of got through qualitative data, he acquired some findings and acquired a sense of what the field was like, what the main characteristics were, and he developed that in this solo author paper that is under review. And then after some thinking, and we were in touch on personal matters, and then at some point, the idea of like making a collaborative paper that extends on his previous paper by triangulating his findings with network analytic approaches. And this is basically what we are working on. We are finishing the paper, and hopefully we can submit it soon. But this is basically what we did through very simple data collection. Even so simple that it looks naive, and we take this naiveness as a strength for our argument. So basically, we collected of 130 charities present in Greater Manchester who are on Twitter, who follows each other, who follows whom on Twitter, and this is the basic network that we studied. So these are four of the main findings of his main qualitative findings. I don't have the time to go through all of them, but we can go back. The thing is that what we did was kind of convert them in network expectations. So these findings provided us with some network hypotheses about what we should find in order to corroborate those findings. We devised network analytic strategies and tools to test these hypotheses. And basically, the first two findings, we found corroborative evidence of the first two. The third one, mostly yes, although not completely. And the fourth, about the broader environment, the dependence and the interdependence with other fields, a little bit less. So, I mean, mostly there is a mismatch between the two strategies, the qualitative evidence and the network evidence, although some overlaps are there. And then the second illustration is the study, my doctoral research basically on Basque environmental collective action in the Basque country. My general aim was to study the pervasiveness of salient political divisions even in apparently unconnected issue-specific collective action fields. And as a case of a study, I took this one for reasons that I don't have the time to explain, but we can maybe address it in the discussion. And the basic proposition, my basic hunch, not very original, I have to say, was that the ETA's abandonment of violence in October 2011, that is the end of violent conflict, was a transformative event that altered the dynamics and the functioning of many fields within Basque society, including collective action fields. So, as empirical data, I reconstructed the network, the interorganizational network of environmental collective action at 6 different years throughout the period of analysis. And, I had the literature review said that before 2011, the field was expected to be to find high levels of mobilization, high levels of organizational fragmentation, and high levels of ideological sectarianism. And I addressed these two questions, whether ideologically cross-cutting collaboration became more frequent after 2011, and I mostly my evidence corroborated this question, this hypothesis. I found evidence of boundary deactivation. And then the other one related whether the relational logics of conducting collective action, modes of coordination under some analytical framework, significantly changed in the new context. And I found partial evidence of that. So no dramatic change, but some significant ones. So, but the thing was not, what I wanted to show was not so much by my empirical findings, but more the contributions that strategic action field theorizations made to how it improved, I think, my research. And it improved in two ways, probably. On the one hand, because it heightened my sensibility about the boundary specification problem, which is very prevalent in social network analysis, but especially in sociocentric analysis, but often not dealt very clearly, not very transparently, and not taken seriously, I think. And here it led me to devise an inductive procedure for determining the network composition at each of the 6 points in time. So these two networks is just to show that these are the networks at 2 different years, and the green nodes are environmental organizations proper. And as you see, they are not even half of it. So the others were other kind of factors, political parties, trade unions, other kind of civil society organizations. So if I had restricted my analysis only to environmental organizations, networks would be completely different, and I think would represent a completely different thing, but not the environmental collective action field. And then the second point is that the second contribution is that strategic action field emphasis on the field's multi-level nature and interdependence. And on the other hand, on the dynamic nature of the rules that govern interactions, that they are not given and permanent, that provided a solid theoretical ground that implicitly guided, I didn't make it explicit in my dissertation, but it guided the interpretation of my results and their significance. And actually, this is what I would like to probably make it explicit in converting my dissertation in a book proposal, and try to also, through social strategic action field theorizations, to generalize a bit my findings. So to make my findings appealing also to readers who may not be interested in Basque, in the Basque country at all, or in environmental collective action at all, but they are interested in fields. And I think my research could say something interesting about it. So just to finish, just a recapitulation of the point I have made throughout. Yes, I think they can really go together. I hope I can convince you a little bit of the compatibility of strategic action of generally field theory and social network analysis, but more specifically for strategic action field and interorganizational networks. And because I think the benefits go in both ways, and these are the main benefits that I see: how social network analysis improve empirical investigation, operationalizations of strategic action fields, and the other way around, how the strategic action fields provide orienting lenses for SNA's social network analysis, research, designs, and the interpretation of results. So yeah, I mean, and this goes against what their own theory said. So it's sometimes like sounds like an �R𝐸𝐸𝐾, right? I mean, I agree with some points, some objections that Flickstein and McAdam and Bourdieu himself made, that we should be aware of not equating a network with a field. So just naively, and not reduce a strategic action field to its network representation. And I completely agree with that part. So because that would be a reification of networks. So we should be aware of the limitations of networks, and it's not the only way of studying and operationalizing a field. And it's whenever triangulation is possible, I think we should pursue that path. But I think they overstated the incompatibilities. They overstated the differences, or the things where they didn't completely overlap, and they stated as incompatibilities, which I think they don't exist. While they obscure all the affinities. So because these big names really made their case against social network analysis operationalizations, I think many people don't take this path, because and what I think we could gain a lot from this symbiosis. So I hope I have convinced you a little bit of that, and yeah, I hope we can have. I wait for your feedback, criticism, and questions during the discussion. Thank you.
Livia is going to present the role of social networks and migration decisions during retirement. Insights from a Swiss Spanish case study. Livia is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Sociology from the, how do you pronounce that?
University of Neuchâtel.
Thank you. As a social scientist, she has a particular interest in questions concerning migration, political and economic trends, and data analysis. In the framework of the National Center of Competence and Research of Migration and Mobility, she is currently studying mobility patterns, transnational practice, care arrangements, and social networks for older adults, moving from Switzerland to Spain. Livia?
Thank you very much for the introduction, Carla. So thank you very much for having me again. So I was here for a fellowship between October and February this year, and I'm very happy to be back just 2 months later. So my presentation is structured as follows. I will give a short overview of the whole project, in which I'm also currently doing my PhD project, and then focus a bit more on the project itself. And then I will make a traditional paper presentation, but I have to say it's my first one, as it is also my first empirical paper I'm working on, as before I did a lot on methods, as I didn't have my data because of COVID. So the project in which I'm working has a very long name. It's called Transnational Aging, Post-Retirement Mobilities, Transnational Lifestyles and Care Configurations. And broadly speaking, we have two main research questions, which are, firstly, what kind of transnational mobilities do aging populations engage in and what drives them? And also what factors shape individual trajectories of transnational aging mobility. If you want to have a bit more information, we have a project homepage and also a homepage on the two surveys. We answer these two questions by conducting a mixed method research design consisting of two quantitative surveys and one qualitative field work. Here you can see a summary of the mixed method research design. So as I said, we have two surveys. The first one was conducted between January and July 2020 in Switzerland, so with residents in Switzerland, all aged 55 plus. So we don't focus on a specific nationality nor on a migration background. We really have all kinds of biographies in the survey. The quantitative survey was conducted in December 2020 till June 2021. And here, for organizational reasons, we had to focus on one specific nationality. So we did it with Swiss citizens aged 55 plus living abroad. So we sent our survey to 10,000 people living around the world. Then we have the qualitative fieldwork in Spain, and theoretically it was planned to also do one in Morocco, but as you see, I only have 5 interviews. So this is the case because of the COVID-19 pandemic, so I had to focus on Spain. I won't spend too much time on the characteristics of the participants of the qualitative fieldwork, because I will come back to this subject in a moment where I present my PhD research. But in general, I conducted semi-structured interviews with individuals who receive a Swiss old age and survivors insurance, which is the pension in Switzerland, and engage in some kind of way in transnational mobility since they retired. So it is not important for me if they migrated before retirement. For me, it is only important that they are mobile or that they migrated now that they are retired. I conducted the interviews between June 2020 and August 2021. So my PhD project. So my empirical interest was, as most of the PhDs, to expand in some kind of way the literature. So when I was reading at the beginning of my PhD all kinds of papers focusing on aging migrants, I saw that there is actually quite a lot of literature. However, the literature is very separated. So we have one on return migrants, we have literature on international retirement migrants, which is also known as lifestyle migrants, we have the so-called flight grannies, and so on. So my interest was to bridge all kinds of categories and see what we see. So if they are really so different, because the literature really focuses on the differences between these kind of categories, or if we also find some kind of similarities. The other interest was to take into account hardly analyzed aging populations. I call them here onwards migrants. So these are people who move, for example, from the UK or from Colombia or another country to Switzerland for example, working purposes, and are now moving to Spain for retirement. The main characteristics of my sample, so all participants have a connection to Switzerland. This can be all kinds of connections. So the importance for me is that they lived once in the country. and then also that they reach statutory retirement age. The statutory retirement age in Switzerland is 65 for men and 64 for women. And when you lived and worked in Switzerland and you reach statutory retirement age, you also receive this Swiss old age and survivors insurance, which is why this is the main characteristic of the sample. The second one is, as I already said, that they engage in some kind of way in mobility since they reach retirement age. So I was confronted with the questions how to reach mobile older adults of various nationalities living in Switzerland and in Spain. I recruited my participants through various channels. The two main channels are an announcement published in the Swiss Review and the collaboration with the Central Compensation Office. So the announcement in the Swiss Review is published 6 times a year. It is sent to people who are registered in the Swiss consulate. And so I was able to take a whole page. This was very friendly. And so I was able to make some publicity. And I asked them if they're interested in the project, which I just presented, they can call me, make me an email, or whatever. And so this was very successful, I have to say. It was my mom's idea. And the second one, yeah. And the second recruitment channel was an invitation letter. So yes, I established a collaboration with the Central Compensation Office of Switzerland, which is the office that pays the pension. Which was a very lengthy process, but it worked out at the end. And the pension is paid to any person who has worked in Switzerland, so regardless of nationality, also country of residence. So if you have worked once in Switzerland and then you move somewhere else, you are still entitled to the pension. And the compensation office created then a sample from the pension register consisting of 290 randomly selected older adults living in the Comunidad Valenciana and Catalonia. In the sample, there were 160 men and 130 women, aged between 65 and 91, and they were all contacted by this invitation letter in March 2021. Also, very interestingly for our case, in the sample, 19 different nationalities were represented. So this is exactly actually what I wanted. And this is also how I was able to significantly diversify my sample, because with the announcement in the Swiss Review, I was, of course, only able to contact Swiss people. Then I had, so if you want to read a bit more about this collaboration, I made a very short piece in the newsletter of Aging in Europe, where you can also see the theoretical background of this kind of considerations. Then the other 2 recruitment channels was one snowballing sampling and then some personal contacts, but these were of minor importance. Then the Spanish case study, I conducted in total 45 interviews. I conducted them in French, German, and Spanish. In total, I did 29 face-to-face interviews and 16 online interviews. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I used Skype, WhatsApp, and Zoom for this kind of interviews. We discussed quite a lot of subjects. So my interviews, normally the length of the interviews were good 2.5 hours till 3 hours, sometimes more. So the subject discussed was, I started with some introductory questions, in which we discussed the age and marital status, nationality, and so on. But I also opened the floor for their narrative by asking them to tell me about their life before retirement. Then normally they spoke about their professional careers, but also their family life. Then we focused more on their life after retirement and their transnational mobility. So what were the reasons, motivations to be mobile in old age, but also why Spain? and then what kind of mobility patterns they have. So if they move back and forth, if they relocate, or how many times they travel back to Switzerland to visit, for example, their family and friends. Then we moved to other transnational practices. These were, for example, political participation, activism, feelings of belonging, but also if they read newspaper from another country, and so on. Then there was a block of questions on their health situation, their satisfaction with the local health system, and also a bit on the COVID-19 pandemic, as it influenced a lot their mobility. Finally, I asked them about some future mobility plans, so if they are planning to go back to Switzerland at one point of time, or if they want to stay in Spain. So for 30 of these interviews, I also conducted a social qualitative network analysis, which is the data I will be focusing on for the paper. The title at the moment of the paper is The Role of Social Networks in Migration Decisions During Retirement, Insights from a Swiss-Spanish Case Study. I will start with a short presentation of the state of the art and then present the research gaps and the question. So what do we know? The literature available on social networks and mobility of older adults is actually quite limited. I would summarize the literature in 3 foci. The first focus is all about older migrants keeping the ties with family members living in their home country. Here, the literature points to the important role that information and communication technologies play in maintaining such networks or support networks. Baldassar and Wilding, for example, talk about digital kinning practices that give older migrants access to a source of social connection and also emotional support. And then there is also the literature that shows that individuals engage in transnational mobility in old age to support their children in their caretaking responsibilities. So these are grandparents who actually were left behind, so we can say, and their children migrated to another country for work, and then these grandparents move to the so sometimes, for example, for a month or some weeks, move to the country of residence of their children to take care of their grandchildren during summer vacations, classically, for example. This is also why they are called flying grannies, but they are also called the zero-generation grandparents or transnational grandparents. Then we can also see that adults who migrated to another country in old age regularly travel back to their former country of residence to visit their family and friends. So we see that information and communication technologies play an important role, but also regular travels play an important role to keep the connection alive. The second focus discusses migration as a strategy to enhance social networks and to gain new ties. This was actually quite new for me when I read this. In the region of Alicante, for example, we can find some kind of expatriate communities. And these are all of similar age and also with a similar lifestyle, as most of them migrated really in old age. And such communities make it very easy for newly arrived residents to make new friends and acquaintances. And these communities are also a very important source of information, advice, or practical help. Then the final focus lies on the size and the composition of the social network and how these influence the mental health and well-being of older adults. These studies are mainly quantitative and show the large personal networks are important for the life satisfaction and the health of older adults, which is actually a hypothesis that we all could have. And this is particularly true for family networks. So in this short summary, we see that expatriate communities and the solidarity and support lived in these communities can positively influence the migration decision in old age. However, there is not much more to find in the field of social networks and mobility of older adults that indicates how social ties influence the migration decision. What we can see in the literature on migration and social networks, however, is that there is a lot of evidence showing that social ties do influence the migration decision-making process. In some, we find 3 different ways in which those processes can be shaped by the social network. So first, we can observe that strong personal relationships in the current country of residence make the decision to migrate more difficult. So people are normally a bit more reluctant to move when they have strong connections in the country in which they are living. Then second, contacts in the destination country may positively support the decision to migrate by, for example, providing information and first point of contact. And this is exactly what we saw in these expatriate communities before. Third and finally, the social networks also influence the choice of place by forming, for example, so-called migration corridors, which assemble immigrants from one place in the new place of residence. In this sense, social networks have the potential to influence the migration decision-making process by reducing the risks and also the costs of migration. The literature on the role of social networks in migration decision-making process is quite well established for example, students and labor migrants, but only very little is known about the role of these social ties in the decision-making process of the population that I'm studying. So this is why I formulated the following research questions. How do social networks influence the migration decision process of older adults? And I would like to do this in 3 sections. But before we go to the results, I want to elaborate on the data that I'm using for this paper. So as a reminder, I have 30 semi-structured interviews that include systematic data on social networks. So I only have data between ego and alter and not alter-alter relations. I conducted them with 4 couples and 26 individuals. All participants are aged between 66 and 89. And I have 20 men and 14 women in the sample. For the paper, I chose a comparative analysis of 4 groups. This is mainly because at the moment there is a special issue planned, and so they are interested in comparative analysis. And I also believe that the inclusive approach of my PhD in terms of nationalities and migration background is actually quite convincing and intriguing. So I want to put this forward. And so I decided to focus on this aspect as my data allows for such comparative analysis. So I constructed 4 groups of older adults. I have first-time migrants. I called them this way, but if you have other ideas, I'm absolutely open to change the names or the names of the categories. So these are individuals who spent their whole lives in Switzerland and are now migrating for the first time retirement age. I have the return migrants. These are people who from Spain, they migrated in the 60s, 70s to Switzerland and are now moving back. But I also have one case in which a first-time migrant lived about 15 years in Spain and then moved back to Switzerland. Then I have the onward migrants, and as I elaborated before, are the individuals who moved to Switzerland from another country than Spain, for example, UK, Germany, Argentina, Colombia, and are moving to Spain for retirement. And then I have the local older adults. So these older adults keep their residence in Spain, but are living for 3 to 6 months per year they reside in Switzerland and spend 3 to 6 months in Spain. For the data analysis, all interviews were systematically and fully transcribed, and to facilitate the coding process, I used 𝐁𝐿. So preliminary results. At this point in time, I have coded about half of my interviews because of an IT attack also at the University of Neuchâtel. So I'm only able to code since 3 weeks again. And I also lost some of my codings because of the cleanup of the server. So please keep in mind that these results are very preliminary. The first section of result, in the first section of result, I want to illustrate the social networks of the 4 groups of older adults. So I found it interesting to give an overview and to see if there are differences in the social networks itself. So for the first-time migrants, what I'm observing till now is that most of the social network is in Switzerland, which is actually not quite surprising, as they live their whole life in Switzerland. However, we also find a few connections to other countries, as some siblings, for example, move to another country to work. So I have some cases where a sibling lives in the United Arab Emirates, in Canada, also in France. Then for return migrants, the social network is generally split between Switzerland and Spain. However, I observed that the social network in Spain is quite shrinking, as it consists of aunts, cousins, siblings, and so on that have the same age or are older. In the case of onwards migrants, we find a very vast variety of geographical dispersion in the social network. So while, again, most important people, which is mostly the children and grandchildren, live in Switzerland, there are other family members that are back in the home country. Also, other siblings have migrated to another country. Finally, the social network of local adults, it's concentrated in Switzerland. Normally, or generally speaking, they only have some loose friendships in Spain, as, for example, neighbors that they maintain active and also can ask for help if needed. So I plan to illustrate these social networks for each group. So I will make a typical social networks for each group, and I would like to do this with egograms, which I will generate with R. So this is not, and so this picture is not an example from my data. I took it from the tutorial. This is also because I haven't finished the coding process, but I wanted to show you what I plan. Then the second section of results, I want to analyze how the social network influenced the migration decision per se. So with this, I mean, do I migrate, yes or no? And to that end, I also must say that my data does not allow me to draw any conclusions about the negative answers. So no, I do not migrate, because all of my participants are mobile. So after all, this was one of the main criteria of my sample. So I cannot say anything. I don't have any example in which this was the case. Interestingly, I could not find any indications in my data showing that expatriate communities motivated or supported all the adults in their decision to move. So this is not in line with the literature. Moreover, there were very few negative reactions to the migration decision in the environment of my participants. So in each interview, I asked specifically how was the reaction of their environment to their migration decision. And I had very few negative reactions. And in case there was a negative reaction, it was mostly because the decision came as a surprise for the children or other loved ones. And or when the children expected their parents to support them with childcare. So then the reaction was a bit more negative. However, these negative reactions did not change the decision of my participants. So this is quite important. This also shows that other reasons, so for example, the difficulty to live in Switzerland with the small pension, were more important than meeting the expectations of the social network. But still, I have a few examples which show how influential social networks can be, and this is what I would like to show you. So one example is Magdalena Young. She's 78 years old, and she's a non-white migrant. So she was born in the Czech Republic, then moved to Germany, and then moved to Switzerland, where she spent about 40 years of her life. And 3 years ago, she moved to Spain, although she never had the intention to leave Switzerland during retirement. So she told me, we is her partner and herself. We met here in Spain when I was on holiday with my friend. And then we saw each other here and then in Switzerland. And now I have been here in Spain for 3 years because we did not want to keep traveling back and forth. He is also retired and he cannot live in Switzerland on his pension. So we decided that I would move, even if very reluctantly, I have to say, because Switzerland has been home for me. But I was alone and I was a widow for 10 years. And then, well, I just decided that I would have to try. A second citation that illustrates the importance of the social network in migration decisions is the one of Susie Berger, who is 87 years old. She and her husband bought their house in Spain back in the early 80s, and they spent most of their vacations there. When they ceased work, they started to spend more and more time in Spain, and now they live about 6 months in Spain and 6 months in Switzerland. Their residence is still in Switzerland. And she told me, we go home regularly to pay bills and make sure everything is in order. And we do not want to be in Spain the whole year because our whole family is in Switzerland. So the way our mobility is set up is ideal for us. So the decision not to migrate, but only to be mobile, is very much influenced by the social network. And we find also very similar results in articles which analyze migrants aging in place. So these are labor migrants who came, for example, from Italy or Spain to Switzerland and decided to stay in Switzerland because of their social network. We can conclude for this part that social networks influence positively the migration decision of my participants. However, for all the adults who relocate to Spain, this influence is only small. For all the adults moving back and forth between the two countries, the influence of the social network on their migration decision is quite strong. These are, however, mostly participants that are economically in a privileged position. In the third result section, I will analyze how social ties influence the choice of place of retirement. In sum, I found for all 4 groups of older migrants an important impact of strong and weak ties on the choice of place. I would like to illustrate this again with 2 examples. So René Sandeau is 68 years old and he's a first-time migrant. He has 4 children, 1 is an adult and 3 others are still minors. The plan to leave Switzerland during retirement to move to a warmer country was already in his mind for some time. However, he did not want to move too far away because of his minor children, so he wanted to be geographically quite close, even though he envisaged to move further away when their children are adults. In addition, his former employer owns a house in Spain where he was allowed to live for the first 6 months, and this allowed him to search for a place to live in the region at his leisure. Also, Andrés and Lucia Roca, who are 78 and 77 years old and returned to Spain permanently, emphasized the importance of their many social ties in Spain. They told me, now that we are here, the geographically closest person is her brother. If something happens to us, we can call him, and if something happens to him, he can call us. My 2 sisters live a bit further away. And we have a group of friends here. Just yesterday, we met everyone. Yes, and cousins. He has 2 cousins here, and I have around 10. That is why we are in the region where we have many family members. When you need something, you can always call your friends and your family. We see that it was very important for them to move to a place in which they already know a lot of people so that they can easily ask for help and support. So to conclude, we have seen that strong personal relationships in the country of residence make older adults to some extent more reluctant to migrate, which we have seen for the ones who have chosen to be back and forth mobile. Furthermore, we have seen that contacts in the destination country, but also contacts in the home country, in the case of Sandeau, influence the choice of the new place of residence. And interestingly, we can find quite similar patterns for older migrants as for labor migrants and students. The only thing that I did not find is that institutionalized social networks, as for example the Swiss Club or expatriate communities, play a role in the migration decision-making process of my participants. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.